My name is Dr. Omar Ali. I serve as a professor in the African American and African Diaspora Studies program and also as Dean of Lloyd International Honors College. And I'm joined here today with Kaila Dollard and Allison Beatty. Our director of AADS, Dr. Noel Morissette, is also on. She is managing many things simultaneously, talk about multitasking. And so thank you to her, first of all, for organizing all of us, to my dear colleagues in the faculty of AADS, my colleagues around campus, and other faculty who might be coming from other campuses. Also want to thank all the students who are chiming in, folks from the community. We've had a few people in the chat make themselves known. And also our colleagues who are not here with us right now, who are part of this Granville project. So this is a session for CACE 2022. I'm wondering if we should record it for posterity. Dr. Morissette, is that okay?
It is recording.
Oh, it is recording. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. So this is called Reclaiming Black Spaces in Granville County, North Carolina, the Granville County African American Public History Project. Now, I'm going to offer a sort of an overview, and then we'll have Kaila and Ali come in and add some layers to this as partners in this project. One can't start by thanking enough Mr. Eddie McCoy, who is really the person who inspired this project. So Granville County is about an hour east of where we are here in Guilford County. It's near, thank you for that, Kaila is putting it up. It's near Durham. It's in that part. Its seat is called Oxford. Eddie McCoy is an African-American elderly sort of icon, if you will, of the city. There he is, Mr. Eddie McCoy, who has spent the last almost 40 years now documenting through oral history the lives of Black people in the area. He is untrained as an oral historian and historian, but he is a far better oral historian and historian than most of us out there in his ability to synthesize, uncover, offer interpretations, bring to the surface. He's extremely, he's just a statewide national treasure, if you will. And his collection of oral histories that were documented in the 1970s to the 80s and early 90s are now part of the Southern Historical Collection at UNC. And he works closely and has worked closely with Tim Tyson from Duke, who's pictured there in my office when we were meeting here. So he has been doing a lot of the groundwork which kind of led to this project. There are multiple areas of the project, and we'll talk about some of it today. But Mr. McCoy is a true champion of Black history as we're celebrating Black History Month during this conference and this month. And so let's talk a little bit about Granville County. And I want to just offer a little bit of a timeline so folks can be on the same page. But many thanks to our advisory board, which includes Vera Ciselski, who's from the Stagville Historical Site, Stephanie Velasquez from Granville Museum, of course, Tim Tyson from Duke, Andrew Mahoney, who's the director of the Richard H. Thornton Library, and of course, Allison, Kaila, Mr. McCoy. And also, I just want to offer another thanks to the AADS right now, the program coordinator, Sarah Richardson, who I forgot to acknowledge, who helped to produce this event. So that in terms of timeline, when we think about Granville County, obviously that's a British name that was brought into a space that was occupied by Native Americans. During the 1600s through the 1700s, the Occaneechi and Tutelo Native American peoples were living in this area. Many of them were passing through, as is the case with many peoples. We're not static, we move. And so various groups of Native Americans had passed through and lived and worked in those areas. It wasn't until 1746 that Granville is founded by the English, as it's called, named after the British statesman John Catlett's second Earl of Granville, for those who might be interested. And it was in 1776 that a notable John Penn, a planter from Granville, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So there were people living here in the 18th century, and some very prosperous people made their livelihood here, in part, and if not largely, because of the enslaved labor of Black people. There were also indentured servants. In 1857, we have sort of the culmination, the ending of what's called the Underground Railroad from this area of the South. But in that year, we have two African Americans who were lynched on Harrisburg Bridge in Oxford, or near Oxford, which is the seat of Granville County. In 1861, just to get a sense, the Granville total population was about 23,000, of whom 10,000 were enslaved working in tobacco fields. Okay, so let me just give you the numbers again. About 23,000 in 1861 living, 10,000 of whom, so almost half, were enslaved peoples working in tobacco fields. In 1865, we know that emancipation came. African Americans freed themselves and had legislation to support that action through the 13th Amendment. And there's much more history to talk about in terms of Granville. We have, in 1881, John Brodie and Shadrach Hester, who were also lynched, and we see ongoing tensions, physical fights breaking out as freed people are trying to assert their independence, and there was pushback. Black people were making their own institutions, fraternal organizations, churches, schools, oftentimes housed in the same physical structures. Churches, of course, existed in the Black community prior to emancipation, but they were oftentimes not brick and mortar structures, but people meeting in the fields. And in 1883, a colored orphanage asylum was established, which was the first Black orphanage in the state. And one of its key leaders was Walter Patillo, whose work I looked at in my book on the Black populace in the 1890s. But in 1912, there were reports of Black and Native American free Negroes. So as it's called, free Negroes. So Native American populations were not gone. There was an intermixing of Native Americans, of African Americans. And of course, there was always an intermixing of phenotypically, white European descendants in the mix. And so there's a lot of history there. And Mr. McCoy, Eddie McCoy, was one of the key leaders in the 1970s to push back against a murder that took place in his town of Oxford. And he was featured in the book called Blood Done Son My Name by Tim Tyson, which was made into a movie. And when Mr. McCoy had a work injury and he had time on his hands because he was on disability, one of his doctors suggested that maybe he, take some time and maybe talk to people in the neighborhood and about their lives. And that turned into this huge oral history project. So that's a lot of background. I wanted to kind of just lay the groundwork for this project. And so what we're trying to do in this public history project is to uncover and document the lives of Black people in these various plantations. There's a number of them: the Oaklawn Plantation, the Harrisburg Bridge area, and then the neighboring Stagville Plantation, of which there's a little bit of overlap between these two different counties. That's why Vera is brought in as a person who has expertise on that. And so the two people who are my co-partners here today are Kaila Dollard, who is a graduate of UNC Greensboro. She studied elementary education with a concentration in history, and went on to teach, and decided that she wanted to pursue her graduate studies as a public historian. And so she's now completing her public history degree at UNC Charlotte. And then we have Allison Beatty, who is also a recent graduate of UNC Greensboro, who majored in history and minored in African American and African diaspora studies. And there are colleagues on my campus who are really trying to move the pipeline along to have folks really take on public history, especially communities that have been underrepresented. So it's really just, in some ways, what we're witnessing here is folks who are on the cutting edge of public history that are going to continue to do wonderful work. So with that, I think I'll hand things over first to Kaila, if that's okay, and who will talk a little bit about some of the primary sources and the project. All right, Kaila.
Hello. Firstly, I would like to thank everyone that is here for coming out, the students and anyone in the audience that's interested and here to learn more about history. Thank you, Dr. Ali, for getting me into this project and bringing up this opportunity to present at the presentation today. Thank you, Ali, for working with me and being someone to bounce notes off of and make the process a little bit easier, and the organizers of the event for putting it on today. And I did include this picture of everyone. I know we're wearing masks in this, the image that you see here, but this is everyone that went with us on our last excursion, where we went to Oaklawn Plantation. So what I'm going to do is provide a little bit of background information on the plantation, and then how, when you dig deeper into the history, you find more about the marginalized voices that you don't when you just look at the census records and the deed records. There's stories deep within. So just a little bit, as you can see here, this is Oaklawn Plantation. It's located in Granville County, and we were able to visit in January to go see the plantation. Eddie gave us a tour, and when you look at the deed and the census records, they're almost one-dimensional and kind of devoid of that human connection and stories. And though you see the names of African Americans maybe held as property, you don't know anything about them other than what is held on the paper. So I'm going to go over what we saw on the paper and then what we found as we dug a little bit deeper into the research. So the parcel of land that Oaklawn Plantation was on was acquired in 1810, and it was owned by the Hester family, which they owned more than one plantation in Granville County. They actually owned multiple plantations spread throughout. It was a large family, but this was probably the largest owned by them. And the house was built by 1820. And in 1820, there were at least 10 enslaved individuals living on Oaklawn Plantation. A generation later, by 1840, there were 22 enslaved individuals. So it doubled in about 20 years. By 1960, the slave schedule included 55 enslaved individuals that lived here at the plantation. So that is what we see when we look at the court records. But as we dug a little bit deeper into the research to look for who were the individuals that lived here, what were their stories, we looked at the marriage records of African Americans with the last name of Hester, because Hester was the family name of the plantation. And here we can see that even in a time where African Americans were enslaved and they didn't really have the legal right to get married, but one of the first civil rights that many of the individuals at this plantation after slavery ended is they went to the courthouse to swear to their marriages after emancipation. And one thing that's really interesting, if you look at the chart, you can see the years married. So we have some individuals like Susan Hester was married to Curtis Hawkins, and they in 1866 said that they had been married for 3 years. And if you go over and you look at Isabella Hester and Daniel Hester, they testified to the court that they had been married 50 years by 1866. So these bonds were long lasting. And then you see, one thing I thought was interesting is if you look at Harriet Hester and Jacob Winston, they had been married 5 months. So probably one of the first things that they did when they were able to legally show that they were married was go to the courthouse and get married. And even though marriages had no legal recognition, they could easily be separated by the whim of an owner. The enslaved were able to create meaningful relationships despite the legality and threats of separation. Yeah. And one thing that we learned from Eddie, and what I've realized in my research and in public history, is it's always good to have a connection to the community. Eddie has been an invaluable resource because even visiting Oaklawn Plantation, I'm sure if I was to go by myself and just drive up and start walking around and taking pictures, that there would be a few questions. But with Eddie, along with his invaluable knowledge, he's that connection. And he was able, when we were looking at the list of the names at the plantation, he recognized other last names. And he was able to say, oh, the Cruz family, I know that the Cruz plantation is located not too far from here. So it even brings another layer of cross-plantational relationships that if we were just looking at this list, I wouldn't have had any idea. Just that first layer is enough for me to be interested and be like, wow, 50 years, 30 years, that really shows a bond. But Eddie, having someone that's involved in the community brings in that deeper layer to learn about it. And I am going to pass it over to Allie because Allie has a little bit more about Richard Hester and Chestina Cruz, which were two of the individuals that we delved a little bit deeper on. And she is going to share a really interesting part of the research that she ran across.
All right, thank you. Thank you guys so much. I actually would like to, I just want to start just for a little second, just by thanking Dr. Ali and especially Dr. Morissette and CACE for giving me the opportunity to be among scholars and historians. Just like you said, I graduated in December with the bachelor's in history. So being able to learn within the field of historical narratives has been just such a blessing. So to begin, I would like to just give a little historical context, just like Dr. Ali had done at the beginning. The Oaklawn Plantation, or Granville County as a whole, during the 18 and 1900s had already made a pivotal stride in economic gain through agriculture. So they've been moving a little bit more within the industry. And just like you said, they were gaining a lot more people and a lot more labor was needed. Because of the sandy soil and the mining ports that were coming out of North Carolina, tobacco was a major crop that was produced, which needed substantial labor and to keep sustained and thriving for the community. Unfortunately, through labor in this historical cases, it is through the dehumanization of African-American people that was disguised as labor reinforcements as well as slavery. So unfortunately, those are the documents that we've been looking through. I think the best part of history in this case is being able to live and see what survived and what was left behind from our past. I aspire to work in archival artifacts. So physically being able to be on the plantation or the Oaklawn Plantation or a county that held the largest slave community was so, it felt beyond surreal to me to actually be on the physical plantation and to see what was going on or to see what was left. It was just, it was very emotional experience. I think if anything, I could say that I had, it was very emotional and triggering to just stand in the presence of what was just awful. It was just, there's no words, honestly. And so sometimes I feel a lot of times that we take history for granted just because we're always just reading about it. Even as students, we just read and then we're listening to our professors talk and then we don't necessarily see physically because it's in our past. But when we actually, and being a historian, that's another thing that I love, actually being able to see what was left behind and seeing these plantations and how they're still there and seeing the homes that the people, I'm seeing the homes that the enslaved individuals lived in. Those are still on the Oaklawn Plantation as well. We were able to click through and see a few pictures and walk through and feel and see the fireplace that they left. And it was just, you guys, I can't say how emotional this entire project has been, but I'm so glad to be a part of it with Dr. Ali and Kaila as well as the rest. The Hester ancestry is a very unique and extraordinary primary source archive that I'm glad to be a part of as far as research and development for this project. It's a rare story in American history, just like Kaila said, where a person, or in this case, two persons or enslaved individuals were able to withstand legal actions, nonetheless have surviving evidence from such an amazing timeline of perseverance, where we're actually able to see and go through letters of documentation and see how they fought for their rights of marriage and how they fought to the right to legally obtain their children. What we were able to notice in a couple of the documentations that we went through was that they were fighting for to be able to obtain, they were fighting to be able to obtain their kids. A lot of the documentation that we read or that we were able to see, it wasn't necessarily easy to read. It wasn't necessarily easy to read because, of course, it was through, it was not in a time where everything was orally, a lot of everything was orally done. So when we were able to see that they had kids, or they were able to go through the court system, and then I think they went through a habeas corpus where they were presented through the judge, and they were actually legally able to get their children back, which is not something that we see very often in American history, especially dealing with African Americans and enslavement. It's not an easy legal aspect. The dates mentioned throughout the presentation mainly took place before 1865, which was legal emancipation. So from there, we see more African Americans involved democratically through the court systems. But this was just an amazing story just to see, and actually to have the documentation and the evidence follow through, and we're able to see them moving forward through progression. And that there was just a story that I just felt needed to be told more. We never hear too many stories, or unsung or untold stories about African Americans thriving through slavery at this time. So even though this project is still in the works, it's been amazing to be able to be a historian and to record and research history. Listening to Eddie tell his story of his town and his home, and driving around with Eddie through all of the plantations. I mean, this guy, he's so amazing. He knows everything. He has a book. It's huge. It's huge. And he carries it with him, and he doesn't let you touch it for long because it's so precious, because he has. And like I said, I want to be a historian as well. This is something that I want to do. I want to be able to record. I want to be able to have records of speaking with people. I want to be able to have documentation. And he was able to obtain everything, which was super great. I definitely love him for that. And I'm listening to his stories, and he was just a huge vessel that encompassed the entire county. So thank you guys.
Great. Well, thank you for that. The images that you're seeing, there's Ali and Kaila going through one area that Eddie uncovered that is an African-American cemetery. And you saw in one of the earlier images, these little headstones. These are the equivalent of headstones. People brought the rocks there as a way of honoring those who were buried underneath. And there's a lot of work to be done to, in some ways, reclaim this area. You would easily just pass through it, but of course, Eddie being Eddie was able to uncover this. And it is about relationships. And what I wanted to do, thank you for that comment, Christina, there. It is great to hear about resistance and to hear that some parents were able to reclaim their children, absolutely. If folks want to send in questions or other comments, we would love to respond. But as you're thinking about questions and comments, I wanted to just say something that we use the word plantation, but as scholars increasingly are looking and talking about the power of language, in the same way that we've moved away from talking about just slaves to talk more about enslaved people, the way that both Kaila and Ali sort of use that language, is to show that slavery is not, it's not an innate, obviously, thing. It's something that is actively done to people. And in the same way that enslavement was done to people, people resisted, to Christina's point, who offered her comments, and that slavery was resisted at every point of contact. Many of the people who end up in this part of North Carolina originated from places in West Africa and Central West Africa. And we have to remember that resistance took place on that end. We know through people like Olaudah Equiano's account, who was from Nigeria, Igbo, that people tried to run away and or fight back. And they did so on the way to the coast. They did so on the fortifications awaiting slave ships. People continued to resist on the slave ships. People continued to resist as they got off and as they made their ways and were pushed into situations in the Caribbean and then taken to North America. Less than 5% of the approximate 11 million people that were enslaved in the continent and brought to the Americas who survived, less than 5% went directly from Africa to North America. Most went through the Caribbean. And so these are survivors, to say the least, and people who continue to resist. But some people resisted openly, others did so by other means, whether it was temporarily escaping, maroons. We have a story here in Guilford Woods, New Garden Woods, where we are in Greensboro, of Edie, who took her young child into the woods to not be separated from the rest of her family as a protest. And ultimately she was not separated. The owners of Edie wanted to send her to Charlotte, and she resisted. And we have other free African Americans who are helping those who are trying to free themselves, a person like Saul here in Greensboro. So there was resistance, there was escape, there was armed resistance, there was work slowdowns, if you will. But these are slave labor camps. These are forced labor camps that Black people were put on. And yes, for a good part of this larger history, there were also white indentured servants. In fact, I came across a record of somebody named Ireland. I suspect that this is a person who was Irish. It's just a hunch. But there were people in the records as runaways who were also not Black, but the 99.9% of those who were resisting and were enslaved and put into forced labor were Black people. Yeah, so I see that there was a comment which Kaila was kind enough to respond to Nzinga about her grandfather was born on a plantation in South Carolina. Those kinds of headstones were also on the land with markers such as shoes, cups, etc. That's great. Nzinga, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is a very powerful name. Queen Nzinga was a 17th century queen from the area of Angola. And so it's wonderful to have that kind of homage and honor brought forth. Other questions might come up. And also, I wanted to ask Kaila and Ali also, why is it that you want to, that's great, Nzinga. Why is it that you want to become public historians? I mean, can you articulate some of that? Because we get a sense, obviously there's a passion behind the way you both speak about this and a need to bring out some of the history, but I think we would love to hear more about your perspective on why you want to become a public historian.
I can go first. Yeah, I did a pretty big career switch because I started out in elementary education. And really when I was teaching or when we went on field trips, the things that I was the most interested in was anything that was about history. And for me, I grew up in a town where I was predominantly white, and I never got to hear about African Americans other than Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks. And while their stories are important, I wanted to know more about the everyday people, things that people don't even find as history, like the stories that you hear your grandparents talking about. I just found them really important to preserve and to write down and take. And I was the historian for my family reunion, just talking to the older people there. Like, I just want to be able to make history something that interests others, because most individuals, when you bring up history, they're like, oh, it's so boring, it's just textbooks, there's nothing I like about it. But I'm like, it's really interesting. You can learn a lot about yourself, a lot about others, and just as a way to kind of like bridge the stories of the past and give those people a voice, because their voice isn't really heard, and just as a way to kind of reclaim their voices and make it something for everyone.
Great. Yeah. Ali, would you like to add?
Yes. And just like she said, everything for me, I was an education major at first, so I guess I never said that, but I love teaching. So being able to teach history has always been one of my greatest passions. But I just think it's just something that I've dealt with for a long time, being African American. We've been told for so long that we have a specific history, and this is who we are. And when you go to college and then you, like I've taken Dr. Ali's classes multiple times, when you go and you get in-depth learning on an analytical context on what is actually going on in history, you can see how we are not who people say we are. We are not what the history books say we are. And when you start to see these patterns of miseducation or miscommunication between what or who we are as individuals and African Americans, I had to put my foot forward to be an advocate for us. We have to have someone that be able to learn history and to be able to say it orally to the people who may not understand it properly. I think it's best if we have people that are historians that can tell the story a little bit better, or that can give a little or a nuance on the context of what we have. A lot of the history that we have now, or that we know in the textbooks, is old, almost, and outdated. A lot of the information or a lot of the technology that we have today can decipher a lot more than what we had before. So it's good to be able to go and dig back into the past to figure out a couple things that we may have missed.
Yeah.
That we learn all the time, especially with the continent of Africa. And that's what I loved about Dr. Ali's class, Africans in the Greco-Roman era, because there's a lot new things that are coming out, guys. If you didn't know, especially with polychromy, things that we never understood about who we were as African Americans, and where we came from. And I think learning history is really important, because I think once we know or we learn where we came from, we could figure out where we can go and progress moving forward in the future.
One thing I'll just add, Ali, is that actually Ali has served as an ambassador for AADS, and she brought all of her knowledge and passion for this in talking about the importance of African American, African diaspora studies. It's funny, but I mean, not funny, somewhat tragic, but with the Black Lives Matter movement, people from other areas of my life would sometimes they contact me and said, "Oh, this is why you study this." And I'm like, yeah, this is why we need to know this history. It's very relevant. So whether you're looking at polychromy, which is the idea of multiple colors that were painted actually on the statues, these white, sort of lily white statues of the great Greco-Roman world were actually painted. This was sort of standard knowledge among art historians and classicists, but the general public still thinks of them as just having been always lily white, but they weren't. And so we add layers through the scholarship. And if it wasn't for people like Eddie McCoy and people before him who were not part of the dominant institutions, keeping history alive through oral traditions, passing it along to their family and friends, we wouldn't know a lot of this stuff. So oral history is extremely important. And places like University of Wisconsin back in the 60s started to look at the importance of that in looking at African linguistic traditions and oral history to recapture and reconstruct history there. But we have a lot more work to do that here. One of the great sources that we have from the early 20th century is the Works Progress Administration did a series of oral interviews. And so scholars were able to capture some of the voices of people who had been formerly enslaved. So there's a lot to say about here, but I think that all these insights are really valuable and inspiring. And it looks like Nzinga had a question, which I missed earlier, about how this project has changed or inspired your view on public history, if at all. And I think that's been partially answered, but is there anything you'd like to add, either Kaila or Ali, to this question? How has this project changed or inspired your view on public history, if at all?
Quickly, I'm not sure if we went in depth on the plantation, the Oaklawn Plantation, but the Oaklawn Plantation has been since changed into a wedding venue, which is what made it super emotional for me, because while we're walking the plantation, all of these acres, there's the fairy lights, and there's how they changed things for the bachelorette. They changed or transformed a slave home into a bachelorette and a bachelor room before you get married. And in one of the homes, they had a fireplace that had so many bottle cans in them. I think the people or the bachelors were drinking beer, and I guess as a tradition, it was molded over and everything. People were just putting caps in the fireplace, which just shows you guys, it's just really important to know history. People have romanticized the fact that we are able to see plantations and we think, okay, well, we're not thinking how much of an emotional aspect there was behind it. So I think that's why I love this project so much, because it just opens your eyes to see how or what history was like and how we've transformed as a society and some of the issues that we still have to uncover, and to see it change and see people miss certain things that should not be missed is the reason why I'm glad I'm a part of this project, so we can shed light and maybe make some changes possibly down the line.
Yeah. So let me ask, Kaila, if you wanted to respond, but I was going to ask another question. Please go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say I definitely agree with Ali, and even adding on to what she's saying with like my background in teaching, you always had to have a plan or know what you're doing. So working through this project or working with Eddie and just being able to go, like things just falling into place or figuring out information instead of knowing the outcome and you're going to find an outcome, you just figure things out. It's like a journey. And I really like that for someone like me that likes to know where I'm going and know the end product, that public history is not like that. There is no end product. You're just learning more and figuring out layers, and you have one person's name and it can take you on a journey, learning more about that individual. And that's the part that I really like. And it's so different than teaching. And I've really enjoyed it so far.
I really like the way you just said, you can take one name and takes you on a journey, because that's really true. There are so many threads. And I think one of the things that Eddie has taught me, and I met Eddie originally back in 2002. I was a visiting scholar at UNC Chapel Hill when I was working on my dissertation. Actually, it was 2001 maybe that I first met him. And so I've known him for 20 years now. Is that he has unbelievable patience. He will, open up something, develop a relationship, but he might just wait out a time until the person might be ready to develop some more, come back to them. So part of it is being really just willing to kind of build and go at people's paces, because if it wasn't for the relationship, just to go back to what I think it was Kaila was saying, a lot of this information wouldn't have been uncovered. And so I think that that's an important point, which is that you're saying, which is that you don't know the end product. And that is different from teaching, where you're sort of conveying this is how it is. It's more open-ended. And in some ways, it's a very creative process that one engages in. And a very important process, not just to know new information, but to feel connected to one's past and our interconnectedness as various kinds of communities that overlap. And I was thinking about, there's something almost repulsive of using these almost sacred spaces for photo ops. And it's also the case that many of the people who are engaged in that are pretty clueless about this history. And so in some ways, our job as historians and public historians to bring out in some ways the voices of those who were there. Because I think part of it is, I'm sure there are people who are deliberate and intentional in recreating a kind of sort of romanticized and cleaned up past, but there are a lot of people who just don't know. So we're trying to make this better known, and we're building on the work of many others who preceded us. Let's see if there are any questions. Christina has a question. Were there any documents from the court cases that show what rationale the formerly enslaved parents had to get their children back? I don't know if either of you know the answer. Maybe Kaila.
I do know that there was a letter that I think his name was Mecmucan. He was the plantation owner's son. He wrote a letter, I guess a good judgment letter to the court, but we're still looking into that. So I don't have an exact answer, but I do know there was a letter.
A work in progress. Yeah. So what would be your dream job, Kaila? And then I want to hear from Ali. Let's imagine, right? We have these prefrontal cortexes as Homo sapiens sapiens. Let's use them. Let's imagine, like, what would you love to do? So I think we'd love to hear what your big dreams are.
It was really interesting. When I first started grad school, I kind of dreamed of being the next Henry Louis Gates. I'm really into visual things and creating documentaries, making it really interesting. But the more I go into grad school, I am anything where I like getting history from people. I like talking to people. I like recording the minuscule facts that and tying it into a bigger thread. So I don't know what that would be as a dream job, something where I can talk to individuals. Yeah, so that's still a work in progress too.
There we go. Yeah. Have you ever tried to reach Henry Louis Gates by any chance?
I have not.
You never know, right?
You never know.
Yeah, but he's, for those of you who may not know, he is a professor, a distinguished professor at Harvard University who's known for having popularized a lot of African-American history. And he did a wonderful documentary actually years ago on Blacks in Latin America. So his work is also looking at the larger diaspora. Ali, would you like to share?
Yes, I would love to be a museum curator. Y'all, I love history so much, and being in a museum to be able to, I actually would see myself walking down, presenting each artifact, or having that background knowledge of everything in the museum just seems so amazing to me. That's just something I want to do. In the fall, I took African American art history class, and we learned so much about art museums and what they had to contribute for African American art, and the struggle of getting everything or getting African American art viewed in museums. And so there was a guy that I studied named Fred Wilson, and he is he's from New York. He is an African-American contemporary artist, turned museum curator. And a lot of museums, especially the Brooklyn or the New York Museum of Art, they ask him to come through and rearrange, or he purposely manipulates artifacts and presents them in a way to give a more profound effect. So he might rearrange them in a different way. Sometimes he had a whipping post. I think his art, you can look it up. It's called Mining in the Museum, and they have chairs in a courtroom, or it would be chairs in for the lynchings. And he actually had them, and he would present, or he would manipulate them, or place them in a row, or place them in a way to give a more profound sublime or a different emotion. Because a lot of times we see art and it's just, something that we see. If it's manipulated or we can see it in a different way, it may give a different understanding. So museum curation is something that I'd love to do.
That's wonderful. And we have a lot of really wonderful resources nearby. On our very campus, we have the Weatherspoon Art Museum, which is currently featuring the work of Lorraine O'Grady, who's an extraordinary artist who actually started working as an artist in her 40s. And she did performance art, if you will. And that's a free exhibit here on campus. I would recommend everybody to go see it. It's just it really pushes you. And it occupies the entire sort of second floor of the Weatherspoon Museum. And then we have, of course, at A&T, we have a gallery of African art and some contemporary African-American art there, which is open for partial hours, but you can also reach the curator there, and she has been more than willing to bring people in on a tour. Not too far in Winston-Salem, there is the Museum of Anthropology, which again is another great resource. And then of course, in Raleigh, we have the Museum of the North Carolina Museum of Art, which has a dedicated section on African history, African art history, which our very own Professor Elizabeth Perrell was one of the curators for and designers. So there's a lot in the area to explore. And then of course, in the Capitol itself, you have the Natural Museum of Science, but next to it, you have the Museum of the North Carolina Museum of History there. So very valuable resources. And I always try to take students every semester somehow to the Greensboro Historical Museum, which has a wonderful history of this area, but ties it to sort of what's going on around the country. And there are also historical sites you can go visit. I recently took a group to the Underground Railroad Tree, which is part of Guilford College. And I think that in some ways, there's nothing like learning things in situ, as they say, right? In the space, going to a forced labor camp, otherwise known as a plantation, or going to the Greensboro's Guilford Woods and seeing the great Underground Railroad Tree, which is a symbol of those who were trying to free themselves and help those who were trying to do so. So there's a lot of resources here. And of course, there's a lot more online these days. Let's just take a minute to see if there are any final questions and any other additional comments, maybe Ali or Kaila you might have. Thank you very much, Christina, for your affirmation there in the chat. We really appreciate that. But I think it's been just such a pleasure and honor to work with the team on this project. And we don't know where it's going to go, but we're putting things online. What I'll do is I'll put into the chat the website that we have just for some basic information if you're interested to see that, and you can check it out. And there's also some books listed. Maybe any close to final comments, Kaila or Ali, or if Dr. Morissette, I know that you're multitasking, but I always want to give you a time and space to offer any thoughts if you would like to share some, since we have a few minutes left. Why don't you go ahead, Kaila or Ali, if there's anything else you'd like to sort of reflect on the conversation. Oh, thank you, Patricia. Yeah, we appreciate it.
I mean, this is my first research project to be a part of. And again, I have to thank Dr. Ali because he's such an amazing person and he's so helpful in trying to put you where you need to be. And he will definitely see and he will show so much support. So I just want to thank him and the opportunity to be among scholars and historians. I always will feel so forever grateful for it.
Thank you for saying that. That means a lot. As a teacher, it means the world. It's really why we do this. And I think that one of the things that I think that both of you embody is sort of just affirming others. And I think that that's the best teachers do, that affirm people's voices and support them and relate to people a little ahead of where they're at in terms of like their experiences, their abilities even. And in some ways, when you do that, and that's what people did for me, and people continue to do that, you often become that. And so it's sort of you just grow into it. And both of you are just examples of just how to continue to thrive amidst it all. Yeah, thank you, Nzinga, for that comment. It's been wonderful to have all of you. Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate that. Kaila, any final thoughts as we complete this session?
I definitely agree with Ali. I also would say thank you to you. I had no history or public history experience. I was just a teacher that was like, I'm interested in history, and you took a chance, and I'm very grateful and thankful to learn about the history of Granville County and get to work with such an amazing team and learn from really, really experts in the field that know what they're doing. And it has been really an inspiring and journey so far. So I appreciate it. And I'm thankful for the conference and being able to speak today and everyone that came out.
Well, thank you both very much. Thank each of you who is out there listening in, who's offered your comments, your questions, your observations. It's very supportive of us. And again, thank you, Dr. Morissette and Sarah for all the work that goes into doing the conference, and my colleagues in AADS and our affiliates, and of course, all our AADS students. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all. And please do join other sessions for the CACE conference. We have more sessions today and tomorrow, and we wish you all the best. Have a good rest of the afternoon. Take care, everybody.